Henry Baker woke up in the dark with the usual back pain. 52 years old is no joke, especially when you spend most of your life bent over flower beds and vegetable gardens. He slowly got out of bed, trying to ignore the creaking of the old springs. The room was cold. Last night he'd decided to save the last of the logs for the real frost. "Good morning, Marta," he said quietly to the photo on the dresser. His wife was smiling at him from the worn picture taken in the summer of '98. They had just planted the first roses outside the house. Henry went to the window. Hartley Manor towered over his modest home in a huge dark hulk. The windows of the mansion were not yet lit. The owners usually did not wake up until 9 o'clock. But the gardener knew that if he didn't clear the paths before they woke up, Mrs. Hartley would certainly express her displeasure. He mechanically prepared his breakfast, yesterday's bread and tea without sugar. The sugar had run out last week and the new paycheck would not be due for another 5 days. Mrs. Hartley had delayed the payment again, citing difficult times for everyone. "Difficult times," Henry muttered, pulling on his worn mittens, as if they had ever been easy. It was freezing outside. The first real frost of the winter, the thermometer read -7. Henry took a shovel and began to clear the central alley. The work was hard but familiar. He had been doing it for 30 years, ever since old Mr. Hartley had hired him. "You're just like me when I was young," the old man had said. "Just as stubborn and hard-working. You won't regret coming to us." And indeed, Henry did not regret his first 20 years. The old owner was a fair man, paid him well, and often talked to him about the garden and life. But 5 years ago he died, leaving the estate to his son and his wife, and everything changed. The young Mrs. Hartley considered the gardener to be a kind of living prop. He had to be invisible, silent, and always at hand. They cut his salary 3 times, explaining it as cost optimization. But Henry couldn't leave. Where could a man of his age go in a small town where everyone knows everyone else? By lunchtime, he managed to clear the main paths and check the greenhouse with rare orchids, the pride of Mrs. Hartley. The temperature there was at an all-time high. The old boiler was barely coping. "Mr. Baker," a sharp voice said behind me, "why hasn't the garage been cleaned up yet? We're expecting important guests." Mrs. Hartley stood on the terrace, wrapped in a mink coat. Her thin lips were pressed together in a displeased manner. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Henry said. "I'll take care of the garage now. And don't forget to check the fence behind the house. Some vagrants were seen there yesterday." Henry nodded. He knew there were no tramps, just the neighbors' cat-hunting birds, but it was useless to argue with the landlady. The day dragged on endlessly. When it got dark, Henry barely made it to his house. His hands were shaking with fatigue and his back was aching. He opened the door and froze. It was colder inside than outside. The last of the firewood had burned down, and he had no money for new ones. He mechanically counted the coins in his pocket, 2 pounds and 30 pence. Should I spend it on bread or coal? Tomorrow it will be cold again. Henry went to the window. Behind the glass, the lights of the mansion flickered as they prepared to receive guests. Music, laughter, warmth. He remembered how Martha had once said, "Don't envy them, dear. They have their own lives. We have ours. The main thing is that we have each other." But now he was alone. Alone in a cold house with an empty refrigerator and an extinguished fireplace. And the only thing that kept him here was the small garden outside the window, where every plant was planted by his and Martha's hands. The next morning, Henry was greeted by a heavy snowfall. He could barely see the mansion through the white curtain. On such days, even the birds did not dare to fly out of their hiding places. The thermometer read -12. "That's all I needed," he muttered, pulling on his old boots. Mrs. Hartley had called 3 times that morning, demanding that the paths be shoveled constantly. The guests must not see a single snowflake. Her voice sounded hysterical. She was particularly irritable after yesterday's reception. Henry worked late into the evening, clearing the alleys again and again. The snow fell continuously, burying all his efforts. His hands were numb even with gloves on, and his back reminded him of itself with every movement. At 7 in the evening, when it was already dark, he finally trudged back to his house. He still needed to fetch firewood from the barn. He had used up the last of the logs in the morning to keep himself warm. "Damn it!" Henry cursed as he tried to unlock the frozen barn lock. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed some movement at the main gate. A dark figure could be seen through the snow curtain. At first he thought it was one of Mrs. Hartley's guests who had gotten lost, but the guest had long since left. Henry came closer. A man stood at the gate wrapped in a thin coat that was clearly out of season. He was shivering, wrapping his arms around himself. "Do you need help?" Henry asked. The stranger flinched in surprise. His face was red from the cold and his lips were blue. "My bus broke down," he replied in a strong accent, barely moving his frozen lips. "I was trying to get to the city." Henry took a closer look. The man was younger than him, perhaps 40 years old. His Asian appearance, expensive but obviously not winter shoes, and thin scarf gave him away as a tourist who was not ready for the English winter. "It's another 5 miles to town," Henry said. "You won't make it in this snow." The stranger tried to answer, but only shivered even more. Henry hesitated. His house was barely warm enough for himself, and he had almost no food left. But to leave a man to freeze— "Come on," he sighed. "I have some tea." They had a hard time getting to the house. The stranger could barely move his legs, and Henry had to almost drag him the last meters. It was cold inside, but still warmer than outside. "Sit down closer to the fireplace," Henry said, helping the guest take off his wet coat. "I'm going to start the fire." He took out the penultimate logs and lit the fireplace. Then he put the kettle on, an old one with a chipped spout, but still reliable. "My name is Lee," the stranger said when he had warmed up a bit. "I'm from South Korea." His English was slow but clear. "What are you doing in our area?" Henry asked, pouring the tea. "Traveling," Lee answered, gratefully accepting the hot cup. "I wanted to see a real English province, but the bus broke down and my phone ran out of juice." He trailed off as if he didn't know what else to say. Henry took out the last of the bread and butter. "This is all I have," he said, a little embarrassed. "It's not very hospitable. You're very kind," Lee interrupted. "Not everyone would let a stranger in at this hour." They sat in silence, looking at the fire. Lee was gradually warming up, but something in his behavior seemed strange to Henry. He seemed to avoid answering questions directly, and his clothes, although not winter clothes, were clearly expensive. When the tea was over, Henry took out his old cell phone. "I can call you a taxi to town," he offered. "There's a hotel there." Lee nodded, but before giving the address, he suddenly asked, "What is your name? I want to know the name of the man who saved me from the cold." "Henry Baker," the gardener replied. "But you're exaggerating. I just—" "No, Mr. Baker," Lee interrupted him, looking him straight in the eye. "You are not just. Actions like this say a lot about a person." The taxi arrived in half an hour. Before he left, Lee thanked me again and extended his hand. His handshake was firm and confident, not at all like the trembling man Henry had found at the gate. Henry woke up to a sharp knock on the door. It was only 6 in the morning. At the door stood William, the young assistant to Mrs. Hartley's housekeeper. "Mrs. Hartley wants to see you in the greenhouse. At once," he said, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. In the greenhouse, he was in for a real treat. One of the pipes in the heating system had burst due to the night frost, and water flooded the floor. Most of Mrs. Hartley's orchids were frozen. "This is unacceptable," she shouted, waving her arms. "Do you have any idea how much each of these plants cost?" Henry stared at the dead flowers in silence. He had warned them last month that the heating system needed to be repaired, but the landlady refused to allocate funds. "From now on," her voice became icy, "your salary will be reduced by £50. This will cover at least part of the damage." "But ma'am," Henry tried to argue, "I warned you about the heating problems." "Enough," she cut him off. "You were supposed to find a solution. What am I paying you for anyway?" She turned around and walked out, leaving him in the middle of a rout. £50 meant that he would now be paid even less than the cleaning lady. Henry spent the day mechanically doing his job, trying not to think about the future. He went to the local shop to buy some bread and overheard a conversation among the locals. "Did you see that helicopter yesterday?" Mrs. Thompson, the baker's wife, said excitedly. "It landed right on the Richardsons' field." "They say there are some important people from London," another woman said. "Maybe politicians." Henry remembered his guest from yesterday. Something about the story was bothering him. When he returned home, he took out the old box where he kept his savings. £230 was all he had managed to save in recent years. It wasn't even enough to buy a ticket to see his sister in Manchester. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Mary, Hartley's elderly maid, stood on the threshold. "Henry," she whispered, looking around, "I heard Mrs. Hartley on the phone. They want to get rid of you." He nodded. It was to be expected. "They've hired a new gardening company," Mary continued. "Young guys with new equipment. It's cheaper." Henry looked out the window at his small garden. The roses he and Martha had planted 20 years ago were still blooming every summer. "What now?" he asked, more to himself than to Mary. "Maybe your sister," she began. "She has enough problems of her own," he interrupted. After her husband fell ill, they were silent. The sounds of music came from the mansion. The Hartleys had guests again. "You know," Mary suddenly said, "that helicopter didn't just fly in. They say some rich foreigner is buying the land around here. Maybe new times are coming." Henry just shook his head. Whatever times are coming, it doesn't make it any easier for people like him. In the evening, he sat by the fireplace for a long time looking through old photographs. Here, he and Martha on their wedding day. Here is the small garden they created together. Here's old Mr. Hartley giving them a Christmas present. It all seemed so far away now, as if from another life, and in this one, there was only a cold house, an empty wallet, and uncertainty ahead. He looked at his watch. It was almost midnight. Tomorrow he would have to get up early again. Perhaps his last days at this job. His last days in the house that had become his home. In the evening it started snowing again. Henry was working near the hedge, trying to save the bushes from the weight of the snow that had frozen on the branches. His hands were numb from the cold, but he knew that if he didn't cut the broken branches now, he would have to uproot half the hedge in the spring. "Just a little more," he muttered under his breath. "A couple more bushes." Suddenly, a low hum filled the air. At first, Henry thought it was another plane from the nearest airport. They often flew over the estate. But the sound grew louder, and in a moment a black helicopter appeared above the trees. The machine circled the estate and began to descend directly onto the lawn in front of the main entrance. Henry stepped back into the shade of the trees, watching. This was unusual. Hartley's guests usually arrived in expensive cars, but never in helicopters. The blades hadn't even come to a complete stop when the door opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out first, obviously a security guard. He was followed by two others in similar suits, and then Henry felt his heart skip a beat. The same tourist he had rescued from the cold 2 days ago got out of the helicopter. But now it was a completely different person. Instead of a thin coat, he was wearing an impeccable business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Lee, if that was indeed his name, looked around confidently. His eyes immediately found Henry among the trees. "Mr. Baker," he called, walking toward the gardener. "It's good to see you again." Henry watched in confusion as the man approached. Same accent, but now his English was flawless. "You are," Henry began, but the words stuck in his throat. "Lee Jong-ho," the Korean introduced himself, extending his hand. "CEO of Seoul Electronics Corporation. Sorry for the little show last time." Henry mechanically shook the outstretched hand, still not understanding what was happening. "I was looking for you, Mr. Baker," Lee continued. "Or rather, I was looking for a certain type of person. And you know what? You have exceeded all my expectations." "I don't understand," Henry muttered. "It's simple," Lee smiled. "I'm buying land in the area for a new technology center, but I need more than just workers. I need people I can trust, people who are still human even in the most difficult of situations." He paused, looking Henry straight in the eye. "You shared your last with a stranger, Mr. Baker. Not everyone can do that, especially when it's not easy." Henry felt himself blushing. "I'd like to offer you a job," Lee said. "To be the head of the garden and park complex of our new center, with an appropriate salary, of course." He mentioned a sum that made Henry dizzy. It was more than he had earned in a year at Hartley. "But I'm just a gardener," he muttered. "You're not just a gardener," Lee gently countered. "You are a man who has spent 30 years tending someone else's garden as if it were his own. You know every tree, every plant, and most importantly, you are a person I can trust." Mrs. Hartley came running out of the house, attracted by the sound of the helicopter. Her eyes widened when she saw Lee. "Mr. Jong-ho," she exclaimed, "we weren't expecting you so early." "I just decided to talk to your gardener in person," Lee replied with a slight smile. "By the way, Mrs. Hartley, I'm afraid you'll have to find a new one." He turned to Henry. "That is, of course, if Mr. Baker agrees to my proposal." Henry sat in his little house, looking at the business card Lee Chong-ho had given him. The gold letters on the black background seemed like something unreal. "What do you think, Martha?" he asked quietly, looking at his wife's photo. "Maybe this is a sign that it's time to move on?" Mrs. Hartley had already told all the servants that that ungrateful gardener was leaving them for some Koreans. Mary, the old maid, ran to him immediately afterward. "Is it true?" she asked excitedly. "Are you really going?" Henry shrugged his shoulders. "I haven't decided yet." But he already knew the answer. He was just afraid to admit it to himself. The next morning he went to the Lee estate. The new technology center was yet to be built, but the gardens were there. The gardens were already there. A huge area with greenhouses, a Japanese garden. "Here you are, Mr. Baker," Lee met him at the entrance. "Come on, I'll show you your future workplace." "Mr. Chong-ho," Henry began, "I'm still not sure." "Just call me Lee," he interrupted. "And don't hesitate. Do you know why I chose you?" Henry shook his head. "Because you did what you did without expecting anything in return. That's a rare quality these days." They passed a row of young trees. Henry immediately noticed that some of them needed extra support. "See?" Lee smiled. "You're already thinking about work. This is exactly what I need." The new building had a separate office for the head of the gardening department. The windows overlooked the future park. "This will be your office," Lee said. "And here's something else." He led Henry to a small cottage nearby. "This is service housing, if you want it, of course." Henry went inside and froze. The house was almost like the one he and Martha had dreamed of, with large windows and a terrace for flowers. "I can't," he began. "Yes, you can," Lee said firmly. "And you know what? You deserve it. Not with this cup of tea, but with your whole life. 30 years of honest work, doesn't that deserve a reward?" A week later, Henry closed the door of his old house for the last time. All his belongings were packed into one van. Mary cried as he said goodbye, and Mrs. Hartley defiantly did not come out. When he passed by his little garden for the last time, he stopped by the rose bushes. "I'm sorry, my dear," he whispered, "but I think you would understand." He took out a small shovel and carefully dug up one of the bushes. the one he and Martha had planted on their wedding day. This would be the first bush in his new garden. Getting into the van, Henry took one last look at Hartley Manor. So many years of life. But there was something new ahead, something he had never dreamed of achieving. It all starts small, he told himself as he started the engine, even with a simple cup of tea. And for the first time in many years he felt himself smiling, truly, from the heart. Just like when he was young and full of hope. Maybe it's never too late to start again.